think that clock is actually accurate now. So, good morning. Welcome to Church of the Holy Communion for our adult formation here in the parish hall. Just a little side note, I apologize for our slight delay in start. I was looking at our clock back there, which has been notoriously 5 minutes fast up until I just noticed it's right on time now. So we're all up to speed here. But I'm very delighted to welcome to join with us our friends from Samaritan Counseling Center, Mr. Earl Donaldson and Miss Lindsay Pate. They are here to offer for us a 2-week session on caregiving and caregivers. And I'll let them do the main part of that. But I just wanted to say welcome to them and extend our gratitude for them coming today. Thank you.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you very much for having us. We're glad to be here. It's always nice to do programming here. But I also want to add in that we're very grateful to have returned to Holy Communion and actually have a site now at Holy Communion. We've been here for a long time. There's about a 25-year history, but there was a gap of about 8 years in there where we were not present here at Holy Communion, so it's wonderful to be back. I should probably back up from that. It's wonderful to be back here, and we'd like to just do a program today about caregiving and what that means and the experience of it, and how do we take care of ourselves when we assume that caregiving role. And so what we're going to be doing today is a pretty interactive program. We encourage you to ask questions, provide feedback. You can share your story or your experiences. But we're just going to kind of talk about what it's like and some of the demands that it has. And we've also have a PowerPoint that we're going to be working on the next 2 Sundays that talk about how do we take care of ourselves and the kind of burnout that goes along with compassion fatigue and caregiving fatigue. And so we encourage everybody to really take part in this and just consider yourselves part of us today. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Okay. What I'd like to first start off with is just kind of talk about caregiving. And it's almost a universal task that all of us go through at some point in our lives. We will have to assume that role. But it's a very different kind of process for each and every one of us, depending on a lot of different variables that come into all of this. And so when we're talking about caregiving, each of you is going to have your own experience because there's so many different angles to it. There's so many different things that come into play that make your experience as a caregiver unique. But one thing that is almost universal for everyone is it's physically and emotionally draining. It really can take a lot out of you. It can also be traumatizing because as you're taking care of this person that you love, or maybe it's a person you don't love so much but you're still taking care of them, it is significant. It can provide significant stress for you. And so how do you deal with that? How do you deal with when you are interacting with others? What impact does it have on your family? What impact does it have on you and your friends and how you interact with them? And just everything. How do you balance life and caregiving, or life, work, and caregiving, life, work, fun, and caregiving, and just the general impact that it has on each and every one of us. First off, I'd just like to talk about some of the dynamics that go into it. When we talk about caregiving, the first thing to kind of conceptualize or think about is who are we caregiving? And it's very different for all of us because sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's our spouse or partner, sometimes it can be an uncle or a relative, sometimes it can be cousins even if we're the only ones around. And then there's the dynamic of taking care of children who may be terminally ill or in that process or being seriously ill. And then it adds another wrinkle if it's an adult child that you're caring for. And so there's lots of different ways that this will impact each and every one of us depending on who we're providing caregiving for. Another facet that comes into play is where. Where are we doing the caregiving? Is the person that we're caring for in our home? Is the person that we're caring for, say, in the hospital? Is the person that we're caring for an hour and a half away and we're having to drive there to take care of them several times a week or whatever? Is the person that we're caring for in a nursing facility or a retirement home? And so each and every one of these spaces has difficult demands, because if the person we're caring for is in our home, one, it's more convenient, but also it has the sidebar of we can't get away from it. We're really on call 24/7. And you may be on call 24/7 if the person's not in the home, but it's a very different experience when that person is 2 rooms away and you're caring for them, because it is a much more demanding kind of process within your own home. And how does that person being in your home, how does it affect everyone else in the house? Does everybody sort of drift into the role of caregiving for that individual? If a person, say, is in the hospital, just the impact of having to drive to the hospital, park your car, walk down those corridors, come to the person that you're caring for, walk down the halls, go back to your car and drive home. It's really an exhausting experience, and anybody in this room that's dealt with that knows that if you do that day in and day out, it is truly an exhausting process. If we are taking care of someone who is, say for example, at Tresvant or Allen Morgan or the Parkview, etc., again, it combines that physical component of driving, parking, walking, going to visit the person you know, but then there's also this sort of side part that we see where we see lots of people in similar situations, or we run into people we know taking care of their loved ones. And so there's this sort of spreading effect of that whole idea of caregiving. And if we're taking care of someone in another city or state, just the time that it takes on top of the emotional impact of taking care of someone. So it's another sort of facet to this very complicated process of caregiving. Another process that becomes, or another piece that becomes involved in all this is that, are you the only caregiver? Are you the only one that's available to take care of your loved one? Are you not the only person available to take care of a loved one, but you're the only one doing it? In other words, there's other people who could be providing help or support, and either they're not available because they live elsewhere, or they're not engaged, and you're having to assume that role. And what are the kind of emotions that brings up on top of all the emotions that are involved in caregiving? And a final facet that I want to two facets I want to talk about too is that what type of caregiving are you giving? And by that, it's how demanding is this piece that you're working with. Is the person, are you doing the physical work of getting the person up and down and tending to those physical needs? Is it just the emotional part of it? And so that can have a big impact on what it does to you. Another piece is, were you expecting this? Were you expecting this role of caregiver? Were you expecting it to come now? Did you think it was down the road? Is this a sudden type of caregiving that you're being called to do? Is it a sudden traumatic type of illness or injury? Is it a slow progression? Is it going to be a quick process? Were you ready for this? And all of us, we all know that, for example, with our parents, that it's going to happen eventually. And everybody in the room knows intellectually it's going to happen, but then when it actually does happen, it's a completely different thing emotionally, because we can rationally understand it, but it is this whole part of somebody that we love and we're getting ready to lose them, or they're getting ready to lose us. If it's someone who's losing their faculties or their ability to recognize who you are. That goes both ways in how much does a person recognize that they're failing, how much do we recognize, or what's the impact on us if we continue to help take care of them but they don't know us anymore. And so there's lots of different things that go on when we're talking about caregiving. And how do we take care of ourselves if it's a short traumatic process? And how do we take care of ourselves if it's going to be a very long, difficult process? Something that's going to require us to invest the next several years, and we're aware that it's going to be a very long process. And so none of these are easy things to deal with or to even talk about. How do we talk about the demands of caregiving with the other people we're with? Our spouses, our partners, our friends, our brothers, our sisters, our children. If you've got very young children, how do you talk to them about what's going on with grandma or granddad or Uncle John or Aunt Sissy or whatever? How do you talk about with your teenagers? I mean, teenagers don't listen to you anyway. So how do you connect with them and get them to understand that this is your chance to be with this individual as well? A lot of people, whether we're children, adults, or teenagers, don't want anything to do with it. The whole process of going to the hospital is a trauma. The whole process of going to a retirement center is a trauma. The whole process of perhaps having this person in your home can be traumatic for everyone involved. And so how do you help them deal with sort of this collateral damage? How do you help them understand when they see you dealing with caregiving and the impact it's having on you? How do you get relief? How do you get away with the exhaustion that comes with it? How do you get away and not feel guilty? Or how do you get away when you're resentful? What if you don't want to be in this role? What if you're sort of pressed into it? How do you deal with that emotion? Because all of us would want to think we're better persons than that to take care of somebody, but the truth is sometimes we get pushed into this role and resentment builds because you're doing it alone, and say one of your siblings or someone else in the family is not going to help when they could. And so all of these things play into this kind of whole gestalt of caregiving and what it does to each and every one of us. Just with a show of hands, how many people are experienced now with caregiving just in this room? So you can see it's a pretty universal experience, but it's very different for each and every one of us. I'm not going to ask people to share their stories unless they want to, but I do know that, for example, with both my parents, it was a completely different experience because one parent was ill for a very long time, and it was an inevitable kind of process, but it didn't make it any easier to watch that. My father was the primary caregiver. I was a secondary caregiver, and we kind of dealt with this slow process, but it gave us time to sort of come to grips with it on both sides, to have the conversations that you want to have to finish, to bring some closure to things. And then with my father, it was totally unexpected. Milton knew my father and my mother, but Milton knew that my father was still playing golf with my uncle when he was 87 years old, and my uncle was 90 years old. He's going to be 99 today, actually. But my father was on the golf course when he had another heart attack. And so he did not want to go to the hospital. My uncle forced him to go to the emergency room, but my father went only on the condition that he could drive himself. He's having a heart attack, but does that tell you anything about that dynamic? But it was unexpected. That night they were basically saying, surgery, we're going to do a quadruple bypass. Everything's going to be fine. And of course, that's what you want to believe. But the reality is an 87-year-old man having quadruple bypass, what were we not getting? But that was a very different experience dealing with that kind of caregiving, because it took about a month for him to go. But it was a very different kind of caregiving than for my mother. And it's very different from my father being in this caregiving role for 5 years, and suddenly I'm in the caregiving role for him. And this is 8 months apart. So it was really a fascinating process, but it's very different than anybody else in my circle of friends who talks about their experiences in caregiving. And that's really what brought this whole subject home to me, was how different it is for each of us. But we're all called upon to do this. And so, what are people's thoughts at this point about all this? And the emotional piece of it. And the other thing that I forgot to even mention in all this, if you're dealing with someone who is at the hospital, we left out, how do we get information from doctors? We don't get information from doctors. They won't tell you anything. Where we get our information is from nurses. For my father, we couldn't get the doctors to tell us anything. There was like 8 or 9 doctors, but they didn't know anything. Or they would say they didn't know anything, but the nurses are the ones that came up to me and said, you need to get ready. What? You need to get ready. And I guess on some level I knew that that was the truth, but nobody would tell it to me. But when the nurse told me, that was a whole different, again, shift in how I was seeing things. And so, as you know, doing visits, that parking, walking down the hallways, dealing with the person, walking down the hallway to your car is a really demanding part of it. And it's something that you don't really much think about, but that's where a lot of your processing is going on. You're thinking about what we're doing. That drive to the hospital or to the retirement home or 2 hours away to deal with somebody. That's where you're doing all your kind of dealing with this. And so on the one hand, it gives you that space to maybe do that, but it's just physically and emotionally exhausting. Or if anybody here has ever spent the night in the waiting rooms, even though they have the tilt-back chairs like on the trains, you don't get sleep. And so that gets added into it as well. That gets added in at home. That gets added anywhere that you're doing the caregiving, is that you really don't get opportunity to deal with your physical or emotional stuff. What are some other thoughts? Yeah. Five years, 10 years. And you know, the other thing is, it's really important to have that support system, because that's really who you're going to be leaning on, that and your faith and how you deal with things. Come to me, all ye who are heavy laden. That's serious. That was a big part of my dealing with caregiving. That and my friends. But the other side of the coin is that because I'm very blessed in the friends that I have who love me, they were calling all the time to see how I was doing, which meant I could never put the caregiving away or what my mother or father was going through. And so it's this real complicated thing of I really need people to check in on me, but not today. Leave me alone. But how are they going to know? And if they don't call for a couple of days, then it's, where are they? Yes, go ahead.
My sort of caregiving is intense in that I fly to where my mother is, leave my sister, and my mom has her so it's in short, intensive periods, 4 or 5 days. Maybe you're going to talk about this, but I come home physically and emotionally exhausted, and I wonder if there's a way that I can prepare myself on the front end. I don't know. I don't know if you're going to talk about that.
We will. We've got a PowerPoint that we will be working on the next 2 weeks. This is just kind of the first part. Yes? Mm. Absolutely. And what if you're sort of like the lead caregiver and you have to explain to everybody after every single visit? That's this whole other chapter of exhaustion, because you have to emotionally relive every visit while you're sharing that information with people. And so again, it's this collateral trauma that we're going to be talking about. And I just to come back to your thing, when we talk about parking and walking down the halls at the hospital, that's taking it to a whole other level. Parking and going through the airports. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you want to walk the mic around?
I was just saying that my grandmother had 3 strokes and a brain bleed, and she's from England, and she went back to a little girl as if she was still in England. And my way, because I was a caregiver, was just acting like we were still in England. And she thought I was her best friend, and that's the way I dealt with that. But each family member that came in dealt with it in a different way. And it's really interesting to see how each family member deals with those kinds of situations that come up.
To sort of piggyback on that is that if you're taking care of a parent or a child or an adult child, and the person that you lean on, that you're wanting to lean on or expecting to support you, isn't quite available, or they're not quite with you, or they don't really want much to do with that, the impact that has on you and your relationship with that person. Or a sincere friend that you're really going to lean on, and they're just not emotionally available for you. Then what do you do, and how does that manifest on your friendships and your relationships? I'm sorry? Absolutely.
What would eventually be maybe some of their inheritance, and they look at like, well, surely we can find something else another way, and it can become very stressful in figuring out the cost of all of it as well.
And not just financially, but medically. What lengths are we going to go to if this is an illness? What lengths are we going to go to keep the person alive, or perhaps to allow them to exit with grace? And how many families, let's say there's 4 or 5 people, how many families have you ever heard that agree 100% on what we should do? And how many families have this kind of power struggle over who's going to be in charge of all this? And so, again, it's this just incredibly complicated process in the midst of this other piece of trying to take care of somebody that you love. Maybe it's somebody that you're sort of, this is Uncle John who has no one, and it falls to you, but you never really liked Uncle John, but it's still falling to you. What does that do to you?
I find that unless they're actually going through or have been through this, they really don't have a clue.
Right.
Were y'all able to hear me? I talk pretty loud. My mother's hard of hearing, so I talk loud all the time. So.
Well, and you know, I had this unique part of my life where most of my friends' parents were long gone, and I still had both of my parents. And then all of a sudden, bang, and they're gone in 8 months. He couldn't live without her, really, as it turned out. But you go from being empathetic for your friends to being knowledgeable of what that was like. I always remark to my friends that on the ride home from the hospital when my mother passed, there's a song by a folk singer named Jillian Welsh called Orphan Girl. And it's about a woman singing that she's an orphan. And so that's on the radio, and how that affected me. Well, when my father died and I'm driving home from the hospital, guess what was on the radio station? And so it's this profound change that comes across you that you've heard about from your friends, but you really can't understand that until it happens. And it's the same way with caregiving. You may observe your friends taking care of a loved one, and you think, well, that must be just brutal. But then when you become involved in that kind of process, it becomes a totally different experience, or a totally different understanding or awareness of what that's like. And how do I take care of myself? How do I get through this?
Today's gospel lesson is about the healing of the 10 lepers, and only one came back to thank Jesus, and he was a Samaritan. Is he your patron saint?
He would have to be.
What is your organization? Is it local? How do you get your clients? How do they pay? What are your fees? How do you raise money?
Absolutely. The Samaritan Counseling Center actually started as the Episcopal Counseling Center by Doug Bailey down at Calvary about 35 years ago, because it was 1981. The Reverend Bailey had an idea that there was a lot of emotional toil going on that perhaps was beyond his training, his pay grade. And so they started a counseling center to maybe handle the more challenging aspects of both faith and psychological issues, depression, anxiety, family conflict, substance abuse, etc. The Episcopal Center then affiliated with the Samaritan Institute in Denver in 1987, and we've been a Samaritan program for about 30 years now, and we have 5 locations across Memphis right now, possibly a 6th one coming. But we see basically everyone that comes through our doors, pretty much, and we try to do so in a respectful manner, respectful of beliefs, values, wherever they are on their journey, wherever they are on their faith journey. A lot of people have no faith. A lot of people have different faiths from us in this room. But we are sort of a cross between a pastoral counseling center and a traditional counseling center, in that if individuals are including their faith in the process or in their issues, we work with that. And if they're not, if they don't want their spirituality or they lack spirituality, that's not part of it. They deal with their issues we deal with their issues in a respectful manner, because we're not really denominationally oriented, although we're supported by churches and individuals. We're not proselytizing. We are not conversion-oriented. We're not a get-right-with-God crowd, because everyone is different. And so we see people throughout the city. Our locations are over by Idlewild, over by First Baptist. Here, again, yay. Also Germantown Presbyterian and Holy Apostles. And so we've got these locations, so geographically people can have access to professional care across town. We also take insurance, but we also work with the least of these. In other words, we have a sliding scale that is open to people who might not have the traditional resources to afford competent and compassionate care elsewhere. Because really, when you look around Memphis, there are very few places that still do weekly or bi-weekly therapy with individuals that includes a pastoral or a spiritual component if the individual wants it, but also for people who can't afford it. Because what we know in Tennessee is there really isn't much for people with limited resources when it comes to care. And it's kind of just sort of confusing to me. There's another word I would use, but I won't use it here. But we are a nonprofit. We have 8 therapists, psychologists, licensed professional care counselors. We have 2 ordained ministers on our staff. And so you get the idea that we are a very mixed group of people. And the one thing we all have in common is we believe in this mission. What am I leaving out, Lindsay?
Just about covers it, yeah. I guess to give you a bit of the spectrum, Earl and I are both 2 of the psychologists that are on staff. I work primarily with children, adolescents, and their families. Earl does a lot of the adult work. But it really is, in the same vein that Earl was speaking to. We do our best to never turn someone away. If someone's taking the really courageous step of saying, what life has handed to me is too challenging, I need some support. In the same way that you're speaking of, you have to have your support system. Having someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight and can take an objective look and help guide someone through those experiences is of vital importance. So we try to serve that role.
And sometimes we get people who they're not necessarily spiritual because of what happened to them in the church when they were young. And so that is not really something that they want to address. They want to address the other issues. And so we try to basically be able to be a compassionate and professional care group, but we also fit a lot of the needs of traditional psychotherapy, such as we do testing. Dr. Pate does a lot of testing with children. I do a lot of testing with adults. But we do traditional psychotherapy, we do pastoral counseling, we do a wide variety, and so it's sort of amazing. We go through these sort of spasms where we're on the brink of, failing, and we continue to go. Like I said, 35 years. There's obviously a greater power, God, who keeps us afloat for a reason. Any questions or thoughts about that?
It's funny, I was listening to several things and talking and thinking about support, and I wasn't even paying attention at the word if there was compassion. And we've already buried all 4 parents. We've kind of done the gamut. We've done strokes and heart disease and Alzheimer's, and then get slammed with my son getting cancer at 16. And it was interesting because there's that core of people that one expects based on the day-to-day life we lived coming into that core would show up. And then when that core doesn't show up, and this person doesn't and that person doesn't, I would say the biggest gift that's come is to really discern what is compassion. Mm-hmm. And someone defined it to me years ago. I had no idea how many times it would go through my head, was that compassion can only occur in the absence of judgment. Because where there is not judgment, therefore there is peace. And so I started looking at, where do I have judgment here about they should show up, and this person should do this, or this one should have done this. And then to really realize, well, this significant person in my son's life literally cannot walk through the door of St. Jude because the person can't breathe seeing the little children. Mm-hmm. It just tore something up because it was attached to some other part of their life in some way. And that's been the biggest key for us, is to both create a community where it's supporting us, but where we've got this compassion for others and how they've shown up or how they haven't shown up, or this whole huge world that's shown up that communicates with us all the time that I've never met. Like I get gotten more texts in the last few days about people, saying, hey, I was at Walgreens, or I was at Shelby Farms walking with an Adams Army shirt, and somebody hollers all the way across and says, hey, I'm part of that too. And they don't know them, we don't know them. So that compassion and treating this like it came to teach, which is what my son teaches me every day, that cancer doesn't suck, cancer is my teacher.
Right.
Cancer is a crazy thing that happened in my body. It's not some malicious thing that a devilish thing threw at me. But anyway, I don't know where I'd be without compassion.
Absolutely. And compassion is a lot like learning how to play the violin. Practice, practice, practice. Right. Same as forgiveness. I think when they said, how many times should we forgive? 7? 7 times 70, I think, right. At least how I always heard that was, forgiveness is a practice. You have to really do it over and over before you can actually let something go. Mm-hmm. Love, forgiveness, compassion, care. It takes a lot of practice.
It does, and it can be very traumatizing. And we all came into this with PTSD because our house, we were in our home when a tree crushed it about to that Hurricane Elvis, and it was bad. Wasn't it? So we all came into this traumatized. So I've really worked with counselors to learn skills of how the situation can be happening, but I emotionally leave it. I imagine I go sit on a hill so I can observe, watch what's happening, and then come back in and choose my moves. So it's like hitting, I imagine I have a giant remote control on life, and I hit my pause button.
Yeah.
Because my next response is not going to be nice unless I back off and say, what do I not see here, God? Show me this other angle.
But your response is going to be human.
And my response, it has been unattractive many times, I can tell you. It's my kid, so there's this huge sensitivity. But at the same time, it is, like you said, I get better at it. And I have total compassion for myself in this, too. It's not just for others. Some days are not pretty. I was away working last weekend and came back home and felt like Cinderella for 5 days, like, oh, shoot, I forgot. This is my reality. I'm not at a gorgeous ranch playing with horses all day doing that. it's Sunday night, now it's Monday morning, I go to St. Jude at 8 a.m. That's
Yeah.
what I do. And I also go and play with horses every once in a while. So.
Well, and I think to go off your point, one of the things that we haven't even spoken to, but we will, is all of us are speaking of caregiving roles that maybe were thrust upon us, but some we also chose to do. And in those relationships are something that we want to sustain and repair. But a lot of people find themselves in circumstances where caregiving is not something they welcome because relationships are threatening. And to be connected to someone and to be vulnerable in that way is traumatizing in and of itself, because of whatever experiences we come into the equation with, that caregiving and working on repairing and restoring is actually the antithesis of my desired outcome.
And not all of us are just naturals at caregiving. A lot of times it's through practice. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Lindsay kind of brief us on what we're doing with this compassion fatigue program and where we're going today, and then next week how we're going to be progressing. And then I want to save about 5 or 10 minutes, 5 minutes or so we can do questions if anyone has any.
Good morning. So I'm going to be probably dancing back and forth a little bit because I'll have to advance some slides for you guys. But it's okay. So like Dr. Donaldson said, and thank you for drawing the attention to the word, the first word that's up there, and it's up there multiple times, is compassion. And so much of what we're going to speak out the next few minutes here is from a professional standpoint. But I want everybody to keep in mind, whether, again, we choose to or not, we become professional caregivers, even if it's in a very personal circumstance. So some of the language that I'm going to help orient you guys to is from our world of work, but I want you to understand it is completely applicable to all. I like to bring a little humor into the equation whenever we can, because we're talking about really heavy things. And so in the same way that you said, I have to step away at some points and recognize what's being thrown at me day in, day out. Sometimes I choose it, sometimes it's thrust upon me. So like Earl said, we've got a couple of different things going on here. Vicarious traumatization, that's a big old word there. But again, vicarious, not being personally experienced. Watching my child, my partner, my parent, my friend from down the street suffer can be traumatizing as a caregiver. So we want to keep in mind and consider, in what ways am I carrying someone else's pain, and in what ways my pain is impacting the way that I care for others. Now, it's not the same as burnout. We've also talked about burnout a little bit this morning already. It's just that onslaught. I left Memphis to move to North Carolina to start off my schooling. All of my friends and loved ones who have moved from the Carolinas down to the Georgia coast, they've got some burnout going on right now from the onslaught of the continuous water and the waves. And if we think about waves in that way, they come and the tides move every day without any break in that rhythm. And so burnout can be analogous to that. It's constantly coming at you, this prolonged exposure. So these two terms, secondary traumatic stress, is what we also think of as compassion fatigue. It's that not good stuff. It's what wears on us. It's what brings us down. The complement to that is compassion satisfaction. And I don't think we really spoke to that too much this morning, but I think just your presence alone indicates that you carry some of that with you. That Dr. Donaldson and I chose the world of work that we're in. Again, many of you chose to be in those caregiving roles. Others, it was chosen for you. But there is the other hand of compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction. That for many of us, doing the work and
sitting in the trenches with someone else while they work through their pain or suffering can be very fulfilling. And having that empathy and having that sympathy, because they're two different things, can be very sustaining and can help you take on and move to the next and work with the next client or the next caregiver or the next friend or the next work colleague who says, hey, do you have a minute? I'm going through something. For some of us, that actually rebuilds and revitalizes us to then go home and take care of those who we're living with and living with pain. So we spoke to, as well, people bring themselves who they are. Earl spoke to his experiences with his parents. Many of you talked about your own individual. We don't live in vacuums. We don't live in bubbles. Whatever circumstance we come upon, we carry forward. All of these beliefs, all about the worlds in which we live in. Think about all the different identities and roles that you carry with yourself throughout the day. I am a woman. I am a Memphian. I am a professional. I am a loved one. I'm a sister. I'm a daughter. I'm a partner. I'm a caregiver to some little wiener dogs. I carry a lot of different roles. But knowing that we have those support systems, whether they're positive or negative, because we do have negative supports that, for whatever reason, sometimes we can't get out of our lives. And we carry that with us. In my world, we talk about the kind of invisible suitcase that we carry with us, that you never quite know when somebody's walking in your door and I'm having relationship problems. Well, we often end up talking about when you were 5 years old and what a relationship meant at 5 and how now at 45, 75, that's still impacting. And so we joke in the common world about emotional baggage, but it's very real. So when we're thinking about compassion fatigue and the complementary compassion satisfaction, there are a lot of things that predispose us to struggling and risk factors that we want to keep in mind. Many of them we can do something about. Some of it's what is dealt to us, the dice that are thrown to us in life, and personal histories of trauma or victimization. We may not be able to impact that. Now, the lack of coping skills, you spoke of a beautiful coping strategy that I imagine didn't come very naturally, and you worked on quite diligently with your professional. And we can gird ourselves against some of these risk factors by doing the work, but it does not come easily, and it does not come without supports. So when we think about vicarious traumatization, that compassion, fatigue, secondary stress, any of these terms that you want to use, there's different ways that it impacts us. We think about intrusive symptoms, where it's that thought that I can't get out of my head. It's that belief that I carry now about the world as a scary and threatening place. And if we only hold that thought, we're always going to see things that confirm that out in the real world. And that wears at us. We look at the perception of the world and others as not being able, well, that person's never going to be available for me because they didn't show up that one time when I needed them. And so that kind of intrusive aspect can be really struggling and challenging. Now we also have avoidance, which we are human, and it comes quite naturally to us to be that ostrich and stick my head in the sand and say, if I don't think about it, it's just not going to be there anymore. But we know, in the same way that, unfortunately, Hurricane Matthew may be whipping back around to Florida, things come back, even if we put it out of our mind. And so avoidance, and it's that hopelessness, loss of energy, isolation, I'm just going to push it out and actively ignore it. Well, it's going to come back to us if we don't actually intentionally address some of that concern. Now, that next to last point that you spoke to, sometimes to avoid, we numb. And numbing can manifest in really dangerous and negative behaviors of whether it's alcohol use, substance use, inappropriate behavior. Eating, yes, very much so. And then we think of a third category of symptoms of arousal. So vicarious traumatization. In the face of overwhelming onslaught, we can ourselves get incredibly turned on and tuned up. So at the end of the day, after having been in the hospital throughout, not being able to regulate and calm back down mentally and physiologically and soothing myself in that way. So we're always quick to go. We're always moving and running, and our brains are racing, and our bodies constantly have the adrenaline and the cortisol, and we can't stop. And so we can't sleep, and we can't focus, and we can't be present when we actually would like to be present, or checked out when we'd like to be checked out. Again, eating and experiencing, if our body is constantly on threat and go, go, go mode, our bodies actually change the chemistry in the way that we digest. So they say, just hang on to that fat. You might need it because you don't know when your next meal's coming. It doesn't work out so well. And physiologically, our bodies start to break down. So Earl talked about traditional psychotherapy. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. So we look at how our thoughts influence our feelings and our actions in turn, and that they are all interrelated. And so we've talked about quite a lot of these already. We become less trusting of others. We look at the world and we make judgments on others because it helps us in some way to compensate for something we're feeling. And so we say, life's just not fair. Or this person is doing that for this reason, and pointing the fingers. But my granddaddy always said they're pointing back at you many more than the one that's going out. But we have, again, Earl spoke to it, negative expectations of others. Well, if they could, they would, feels much differently than they're just not helping because they're choosing not to. Your experience, and I think I connected right away. My grandfather just passed away this past year. And like I said, raised here in Memphis. My parents now live several flights away up in Baltimore. My grandfather's just a 2-hour drive. My aunt lives there with him. Worked less than a 5-minute drive from his assisted facility. Maybe saw him a day or two a week. And my mother could not reconcile that in her head because she said, I would be there every morning to greet him with that favorite donut that he has. I'd take every lunch break because she recognized that this was not a forever. But for my aunt, who didn't choose to never leave her hometown, she wasn't afforded the opportunity. She was therefore thrust into that being present caregiver role, whereas we had that. So I could certainly speak to that. So what do we do to compensate for that? And I think this is where next week we're going to pick up more on and speak to. Now that we've really talked and torn you down, there are things that you can do to become more resilient and look at how life brings everything to us. We don't have to just sit with the hand that's dealt to us. We can actively, individually, but most more importantly within our core support network, work to rebuild and repair that resilience. So we'll probably pause on this one because I know we wanted a few more minutes and we're going to be mindful of your time this morning. But stay tuned, I guess we'll say.
Want to add?
I know I tend to speak fast and say a lot, so thank you.
One of the things that we'd like to do is to get folks' email addresses. We're going to send out some additional information about what we're doing and what we're going to be doing next Sunday. Mm-hmm. And then if you need a hard copy, we'll be glad to drop it in the mail, but we'll need your physical address as well. We can do that in the morning or on Tuesday morning.
So again, I mentioned, a lot of this is coming from a professional standpoint, but even if it's a personal relationship, we become professional personal helpers in that circumstance. And so one of the ways that in the world of mental health we look at is there's actually quality of life assessments that we can do to make sure that we're trying to balance that compassion satisfaction with the compassion fatigue. And so we can actually get you some scores and let you look at it and say, okay, I'm actually doing better than I thought, or wow, this may be something that I need to work on, and now I know in what direction I need to ask for help. So if that's something you guys would enjoy, again, please give us your information and we can pass that along.
But we do want to say thank you for welcoming us in. It's wonderful to be back in many ways. And so I just want to say thank you for us and for Samaritan in inviting us to join you today.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, thank you, Earl and Lindsay. Thank you. This was exceptional. Church will be starting at 10:30, and Lindsay and Earl here for a few minutes if you have anything you want to check on. And also, we can work with them to get those resources available here at the church if that's helpful for everyone as well. So we'll coordinate that. Okay, thank you. That's right. And you can call or email the church office or myself, and I'll certainly get you connected. Thank you all.